Thank you for staying with us. This is Front Row with me, Abi Agina. Before we went for that commercial break, we are getting some reactions from our panelists. And I'd like to bring in Sakina Hassan Ali to just also weigh in on this matter around the rent crisis. Over to you, Sakina.
So I think it's important, Abby, that at this time, we are in extraordinary circumstances, and I think that landlords need to avoid taking a hardline approach with their tenants. It's a very real situation. I think they need to exactly as Murigu said, they need to sit down on, around a table and just sort of negotiate it and see what they can do. I do think that tenants, because some are using this to exploit the situation, I do think tenants should substantiate the rent reductions. In some cases, landlords can defer the payments just because this may be a short-term shock. In that we saw the biggest effect of it in March and April and May, but because things are easing in, they may only have trouble. The numbers may be this bad for 3 months, but it may begin to ease out. But I do agree with the other panelists in that I don't think it's a time for anyone to be taking hardline approaches. We need to just kind of work together through it, and I don't think it should last that long.
Sakina, still staying with you, what are the practicalities around this? We've seen some landlords giving rent holidays to their tenants. We've seen others giving an exception period of about 6 months. How viable is it in our current economic situation? Because at the end of the day, the landlords also depend on these assets as their income streams.
I think the landlords are doing, from what I've seen, I think the landlords are doing as much as they possibly can, in that they're negotiating as far as they possibly can, because they know getting a replacement tenant is not exactly a better option. So I do believe that they are being quite lenient. And in other cases where they can't do that, they're deferring the payment, so that especially in commercial properties, where the landlord is not able to sort of maintain his returns by giving large amount of rent holidays, they're deferring payments so that when businesses come online again, they're able to just sort of backtrack and pay their rents in arrears. And I think that's a good way to just kind of manage not only the payments but also the cash flows between businesses and landlords. At the end of the day, it's about everyone getting together and just seeing what works between them. And on one side, landlords not taking a hardline approach, and on the other side, tenants who are well and able to pay, not exploiting the situation.
All right, thank you, Madam Sakina. And Henry, let's take the conversation forward now. As we talk about the rent crisis, how did we find ourselves in this space in the first place? Is it that our rentals system is a bit skewed to the favor of landlords? We are seeing areas in Nairobi where people are paying rent to the tune of over 100,000 shillings. We are seeing in the slum areas it comes down to even 500 shillings. But as an urban city, do you feel our rental regime is well priced?
I think, Abby, before the COVID-19 situation, I think last year and even prior to that, there was this feeling that the rental pricing in urban areas, and particularly Nairobi, was way too high. And you realize that people were paying very, very high rent in certain parts of the city. And of course, we can say this is an issue of demand and supply. When the demand is high, of course, you expect that the prices will go up. But I think a situation arises where we find some landlords who may have been taking advantage of the fact that we have we have high demand in certain parts of the city, and end up putting the rent level at a very, very unaffordable level, so to speak, for majority. So I think we need to look at it in a holistic way and ask ourselves if the market, the property market, is actually skewed, or it is just purely a factor of demand and supply. And in my view, I think to an extent, we had a situation where the market was a bit skewed, particularly in favor of some landlords in certain parts, in the high-end part of the city. So, of course, now we can't talk about high rent because even most properties are vacant because people are not able to rent the spaces. But I think even after the COVID situation, we need to have a conversation on how we can be able to make sure that we have a stable property market and we have a situation where we don't have one party benefiting at the expense of the other.
All right. And before we go to you, Mr. Murigo, I'd like us to take a look at some interesting statistics here on our Super Wall, if my viewers can join us. Well, let's take a look at some of the numbers when it comes to the number of people that are currently homeowners. Well, here are the numbers. Well, the number of landlords in Kenya stands at 5 million. This is as of 2013. And as of 2013, as I rightly put it. And of course, this shows you the various mix. The next element I'd like us to really capture here in this discussion, according to the Kenya Property Investors Association, 17 million tenants are in the country, commercial and residential, as of 2013. We are talking of a population of about 49 million Kenyans. 17 million are paying rent. We have 5 million landlords. Let's take a look at some interesting statistics here again. According to the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics report as of May 2020, in regards to the socioeconomic impact of the COVID-19 status on households, let's flip to the next slide so that we can see these startling numbers. Like we did say earlier on, 30.5% of households were unable to pay rent and on agreed date within the landlord agreeable terms. The next element out of this whole discussion is 21.5%, according to the report, shows that households in Kenya who normally pay rent on time were unable to pay rent for the month of April. It doesn't stop there. Let's look at some more numbers. Well, the inability to pay rent for the month of April due to reduced income earnings was about 52.9%. Half of Kenyans in urban cities are unable to pay their rent. The KNBS report goes on to show us that only 8.7% of tenants have received a rent waiver. I'd like to pick it up with Mr. Murigo. You did talk about landlords to strike a balance. When you look at the numbers, only 8.7% of the 5 million landlords in the country have been able to issue out, have been able to give their tenants some form of relief. Does this number shock you in any way?
Mr. Agena, it's important to realize that when COVID started, I advised the government to reduce the 16% VAT that is payable to commercial premises. The government reduced 2% to 14%. Remember, rental tax is still intact, and landlords must pay their taxes on or before 20th of every month. The landlords to date, as you see where they are and the problem they are on, they are still expected to pay the rental taxes. These rental taxes come from tenants. If the government wanted to help the landlords bring down rent, they would have reduced the VAT payable to commercial premises maybe to 10%, or less still. But if the government wanted the landlords to reduce the rent to
Mr. Murigo, this then means
tenants,
this then means
yes,
less revenue for the government.
Yes, but you are talking about tenants paying tax that is not available.
All right.
Because a tenant will pay tax together with his rent, and the landlord will pick the tax paid by the tenant to the government. So what do you expect the rent to do? Pay 14% for tenants, and the tenants are not working, their hotels are closed, the other places where they make their money to pay taxes are still closed.
All right.
So where do tenants get money to pay landlords to pay the taxes? So one of the biggest problem that the landlords are going through is they do not know what to tell the KRA hard man.
The tax man.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Murigo.
Tax man is there looking for taxes.
Okay. So you bring in an interesting twist to this. Does it now mean that the Kenya Revenue Authority should also go easy on the landlords? Is it even something they can think about?
That's it. That's it. That's it. I'm talking about a policy that would have been formulated by the government. Because that's why in the beginning I said the government ought to have come up with a committee to make analysis better enough to show who and who is not able to pay, who and who is able to pay.
All right.
That way, I think the landlords would come up with a way up.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Murigo. Well, Sakina, before I come to you, I'd like us to look at some interesting statistics again about the number of homeowners. If we could go to the next slide, there we have it. According to the Kenya Integrated Household Budget Survey of 2015-2016, over 85% of households in rural areas and 26.1% in urban areas were residing in their own dwellings. It gets further interesting. Let's take a look at the next slide. Well, the results show that about 7 in every 10 households in urban areas lived in rented dwellings, compared to about 1 in every 10 households in rural areas. And finally, let's look at the next slide. A high proportion of households in Nairobi City, that is 86.4%, and Mombasa, 82.2%, lived in rental dwellings. Madam Sakina, as we continue to look at these statistics, which cuts across different counties as well, as you can see there on the screen, I just want to pick your mind. The Jubilee administration had made a pledge of building 500,000 units within their term in office. Right now, talk to us about the level of the deficit of houses we have, because economists argue that the rental crisis is a function of limited units in the market. Some say we have an oversupply of property in Kenya's real estate sector and that the bubble will one day burst. How true is this?
Okay, so earlier you had talked about the rental. You talked about the rental market and are people being overpriced for rental. The truth is the rental market is a subject of demand and supply. If demand exceeds supply, the price will always go up. So there's no way we can plead to people to reduce their rents if they're able and willing, if they're able to get higher rents, right? Everyone is looking to maximize their returns. The only way to solve this issue is to increase the supply of houses, especially in overpriced segments, so that the prices can then come down, right? Now this can be done, this is currently happening in housing development. So where housing development is very active, we'll see an increase in supply in houses in that area, and then you'll see the rental prices starting to slowly ease off. What's happening at the moment is that a lot of developers are developing in a specific segment, oversupplying specific segments. The rentals there are easing, but there are very many other segments that are not supplied, highly demanded, and that's where the prices continue to remain quite high, even on international pricing standards. In terms of affordable housing, even if the government were to come in and put 500,000 houses, that is just a very short-term remedy. You need to have that is fixing the symptoms, not the disease. Mm-hmm. You need to have the market work so that the economy produces the amount of housing that people actually need. One of the I mean, internationally, 95% of property purchases are on mortgage. In Kenya, it's 5%, not even. I think it might be at 3%. So only 3% of people are able to access finance to buy their homes, whereas everywhere else in the world, at least in the first world, they're financing 95% of their purchase. At the moment, if you were to move to a house, the house that you were renting, if you were to buy it, your mortgage repayments would be 3 times the amount of your rent, and that is because the mortgage rates are incredibly high. If the cost of buying a house on a month-to-month basis through a mortgage was equal to the rent that you're paying right now, you would see housing stock shoot through the roof, because there would be a lot more demand for property and a lot more people would therefore supply it. If you fixed that equation, the government doesn't need to build us 500,000 houses. The Kenyan business sector will do it.
All right.
And they'll do it for a long time coming. They'll be fixing the disease, not the symptoms.
It is, of course, one thing to give that sense of perspective, Sakina. On the other hand, we're also seeing Kenyans are very entrepreneurial. Some are getting into land buying, speculating. Some of the areas they are buying land in, prices are appreciating, and eventually they make a good buck out of it. Whereas we're also seeing a number of Kenyans who have some piece of land somewhere, but they don't have the capital to build, and they build over years. And this eventually sees them still paying rent for quite a number of years before they can consider building their own homes. Is there opportunity in all this, even as people also wake up out of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Absolutely. So land price appreciation is really good, and the fantastic thing is Kenyans have really been entrepreneurial about land buying. I think land is kind of a sacred investment for most Kenyans. That's the first thing they want to invest in, and it's done them very well. You've seen the land appreciation, especially in areas further away from Nairobi, double, triple, quadruple over 3 to 5 years. Investing in that kind of land and then liquidating to then buy your house instead of waiting sort of for these kind of higher level measures is a great way to do it.
Okay. Well, is it true that some say also land is it's an overhyped asset? Let me bring in Mr. Ochieng.
Currently, okay.
Thank you, Abby. And I think before I even go there, I want to agree with my fellow panelists about the home or home ownership in this country. And I think what we need to do is to ensure that we create an environment where people can be able to access mortgage, access financing, so that they can be able to buy their own homes, buy their own houses. What is happening now is that the cost of owning or servicing mortgage, for instance, is very, very high and only accessible to very few in the population. This then means that we'll continue having the statistics you are reading going up, because more and more people will only be able to afford to rent houses as opposed to building their own houses. So I think that there's need for a very honest conversation on how to make sure that we spur up property ownership in this country, not driven by the government like we are talking about affordable housing now, but driven by the private sector, driven by the population who are able to access finances that enable them to buy their own houses. On the issue of land, of course, yes, the land prices, particularly in the urban areas, are normally quite high, and at times we think that they're overpriced. And again, it's because of the kind of demand we are seeing people placing on land. I think Kenyans by nature put a lot of premium on land ownership, and people feel that one of the ways to define your success, or one of the ways to perhaps invest, is to make sure that you have a piece of land somewhere. Because of this kind of approach or this kind of expectation, then the demand for land has gone very high. And then that also now pushes up the prices. That now explains why we have land prices overpriced, particularly in the upmarket areas where the prices are completely astronomical. And you still have people buying them because people who can be able to afford. But I think at the end of the day, we have to be able to look at how do we make sure that we have some level of sanity, if I may use that word, in land pricing and ensure that more and more people can be able to access or afford the land, not current situation where only a few can afford because of the kind of prices that we have placed on the land that we have in this country.
Interesting. Just before I bring in Mr. Murego, I'd like to throw it back to Madam Sakina. Well, you totally touched on a live wire when you touched on matters to do with the number of mortgages in the country. The central bank places the total number of mortgages in Kenya at 23,000 mortgages against a formal workforce of about 10 million Kenyans who are salaried. What can be the best prescription, especially when you look at various models such as rent-to-own, where I remember back in the day, estates like Jericho were areas where people would rent and you would be deducted that rent as if it's sort of a mortgage arrangement. At the end of it all, you end up now owning the home. Are we seeing developers also being innovative in trying to give the market affordable solutions?
The truth is it's difficult for a developer to do that because the developer also has to go to the same bank and will get the financing at the same price, and then he has that financing cost which he then passes on to a tenant, which will result in the same situation, is that the monthly repayment is very high. So at the end of the day, if the cost of finance is high, it's going to be high for the end user, it's also going to be high for the developer.
All right. The
best thing to look at is why is it that our mortgage rates are so high, and really get into it. Why is it that the banks have priced their risk so highly, you know? What is the real reason behind that? If we are able to unlock that whole system and just try and figure it out and see why is it the risk is so highly priced, then we can get to unlocking this housing market.
All right. Does this, Mr. Murego, bother you to see that we have a very small percentage of Kenyans being able to, of course, get out of the rental trap and own their homes? Is it time that we totally revolutionized how we handle our housing component as a country?
Thank you once more. And this is very interesting, Mr. Agena. And I hope the DCI is watching over this program. It is one thing to plan how to purchase a home. It is another on who and how to get it from. I can tell you this evening that many Kenyans who have tried to purchase properties from some few people, very few people in this country. Kenyans have lost money. There are people who would be selling many properties, and when they are paying the money, they disappear, they are out of money, they don't refund, and Kenyans are still struggling to get them to get their refund. So it is important to note that as we plan how to purchase homes from people, they are people, and very many, and we don't want to mention names here, but I can tell you Kenyans have lost millions of shillings through people who plan to purchase or to build or to do anything for people to own properties. But they end up crying themselves because the sellers turn out to be crooks. So today, out of 100%, about 65% of the purchasers have not gotten their homes that they purchased. And they bought and paid out all the money. So our point is, where is the DCI when Kenyans cry that people have paid money to some people, you know them, and for years today, these people are left to go scot-free.
Okay. Very sensitive point as you've brought out there, Mr. Murigo. Well, we want to go on another quick commercial break. Remember, you can engage with us on our Twitter handles at KTN News KE. Our hashtag for this forum is the FrontRow. Remember, you can also share your questions on our Slido platform, where the event code is hashtag the FrontRow. We're already continuing to receive your questions both on Twitter and of course on our Slido platform. When we come back, we'll be now looking at the hard decisions that we need to take as a country when it comes to fixing our housing crisis. All this coming up in a short while.